It's really brilliant to see so many people here, and a real delight to be able to welcome you to UCL. I'm Sarah Chater. I'm Director of Strategy and Policy for what we call UCL Research, Innovation and Global Engagement. Thank you for coming tonight. I am very excited to welcome such a distinguished panel for our discussion on real policies for Real Zero. I will introduce them in a minute, but I just wanted to say a word on why UCL is hosting this event at all. I oversee our Institutional Academic Policy Engagement Initiative, which has a real focus on how we can use our academic research and expertise to inform public policy. But this event is being held as part of our Grand Challenges programme, which is effectively about how we mobilise the breadth of UCL knowledge and expertise to inform public policy, to inform societal conversations, and to ultimately foster solutions to complex global challenges. So we take a cross-disciplinary and a cross-boundary approach to that, and I hope that some of the discussion tonight will touch not only on how we can inform policy, but on how we can take a more holistic approach to tackling this very great problem that we face of the climate crisis. So we're going to go through each panellist for about 10 minutes. A number of us have stopwatches. And then we will have a little bit of a conversation and then open it up to you. And we're very keen to hear as much from you all as we possibly can. I will briefly introduce them before we start. Professor Jim Skeet is the recently appointed chair of the IPCC. And I was going to spell that out, but I'm not going to because I'll mangle it and you all know what it is. He has previously been involved in the sixth assessment cycle of the IPCC Working Group 3. And as many of you know, was Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London, heading up a whole load of research around energy, climate change and technological innovation. And he's also served for 10 years as a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change. We're also welcoming Rachel Solomon-Williams, who is Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group of Progressive Businesses. Now, there's a term we like. Before joining the Aldersgate Group, Rachel worked at KPMG, where she advised on how to harness the opportunities of the transition to net zero, and before that held a number of senior roles in government, working on climate, energy and the environment. And finally, my UCL colleague, Professor Paul Ekins. Paul is Professor of Resources and Environment Policy at UCL. He is the author of a number of books, including the new book, Policies for Real Zero, which will be published this Thursday. Paul had hoped to have a tempting pile of books here, but unfortunately the publishers weren't quite able to manage it. But he assures me that if you collect the leaflet on the table outside on your way out, then you can get a 20% discount when the book is published on Thursday. Available in all good booksellers. Paul has 30 years' experience of working in the area of energy and climate change, including advising parliamentary select committees and the European Commission. So that's enough from me, I think. Let's get going. Jim, can I ask you to come on?
Well, okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And just to correct one thing in your introduction, I was not appointed chair, I was elected chair. So I've discovered the art of being a politician in this process. And just to say also, it's amazing when you get to sort of global level with IPCC, how little you're actually dealing with the nitty-gritty of policy making. So if you forgive me, I'll just cover two things in my remarks. I want to highlight the key messages from recent IPCC work, as we've been slightly reinterpreting them in the light of more recent developments. And then I'll go on to say what IPCC is planning to do or may do in its next cycle, which is just starting. So in terms of summarising the conclusions, we've started to encapsulate it in a single three-letter acronym, which is UAE, and it has nothing to do with the location of COP28. It stands for Urgency, Agency, and Equity. And if I can run through each of these in terms of the conclusions. First, if we look at how we have bent the trend on global emissions, but they're still rising at the moment. In about 20 countries, in fact, fortunately, have now managed to get sustained reductions in emissions over a period of time. But globally, emissions are still going up. As we've seen this summer, we can already see the impacts of climate change in terms of wildfires, extreme events. These were all predicted by IPCC and the scientists on whom it faces its work. But things are happening more quickly, perhaps, than we anticipated. If we continue warming, if we get beyond 1.5 degrees and hopefully not 2 degrees, we can see much worse impacts. We can see permafrost degradation. We can see impacts on the stability of food systems. Now, when we convey all these messages, it can induce a sense of helplessness and doom, which is why the second word is agency, which is sending out the message that we are not helpless in the face of all these risks. There are things that we can do about it. And in the recent reports, we have flagged out indeed the point that more than 20 countries have reduced emissions. We can point to the enormous success of renewable energy globally around the world in recent years. And we can point to the fact that more than half of global emissions are covered by some kind of policy, law, or institution. So the tools are available. And about a fifth of global emissions are covered by some kind of carbon pricing. So we have the capacity to move forward. And since one of the things that we did for the very first time in an IPCC Working Group 3 report in the last cycle was to have a chapter dedicated to behaviour and consumption patterns. And that also produced a very large conclusion that you could reduce global emissions by 50% by 2050 simply by taking up measures that were on the demand side of the economy rather than the supply side. And I'd like to emphasise that it wasn't all about people making choices to turn the lights off or change their thermostats. There was a strong story that individual choices are important, that they can only be exercised in the context of the available infrastructure, the availability of technologies. So think about electric vehicles. Sure, we need people to choose electric cars, but there needs to be the charging infrastructure in place, and there needs to be the availability of technology from the manufacturers. So it is slightly more complicated than just people making specific choices. We need to build in low-carbon routines effectively. Now, the third point that I wanted to make was about equity. And there are really two dimensions to this. One is the international global dimension, where we have highlighted very clearly the inequalities in terms of historic emissions globally, and also taking snapshots of global emissions on a consumption basis per capita, and pointing out the very wide difference between especially Africa and Southern Asia on the one hand, 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per person, up to approaching 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per person in the United States, for example. So very big inequalities there. And joining that together with our colleagues in Working Group 2, who look at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, very clear that the most vulnerable people in the world are those who've contributed least to emissions in the past. So big issues around equity and climate justice there. The reason that equity also matters is also at a national and a subnational level, because I think we're all very, very aware that there has been pushback in more than one country in terms of the policies that might be implemented as part of ambitious climate action. And I think there's a very strong message there that the social acceptance and building a societal consensus around ambitious climate action will only come if climate action is perceived to be fair and treat all groups in society. So the way that we construct our policies is really important. One of the things that I have done, that Sarah did not mention among the many other things, I just stepped down as chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. And then we were really very much focused on this issue. How does the burden of climate action and how are the opportunities from ambitious climate action shared out fairly among different groups in society? So, and we will not move forward unless we get the acceptance and climate action is perceived to be fair. So that's the sort of the simple way we're trying to encapsulate the messages, from the most recent IPCC work. Now, where are we going in the future? We're just at the start of the 7th cycle, which will last between 5 and 7 years. So whisper it, we know it will be 7 years because that's the that's the way things go. And we yet to have a programme of work in place. But our governments will get together in their first meeting of the next cycle, which is in January at the beginning of next year, to decide what the actual programme of work will look like. One thing that's certain, we will be doing a special report on climate change in cities. We've already made a call for nominations for people to go to the scoping meeting. And I think that actually closed last Friday, the call for nominations there. So we know we're going to be doing that. And it is very likely that we will produce the same Standard 3 working group reports again. But there is space from some other work. And frankly, I have a list as long as several pages of A4 of possible topics for these special reports, which will be an interesting session to try and chair to get consensus about from governments about probably the one other special report we have space to do and how that can be conducted. Now, when I was running for IPCC chair, I mean, there were several themes. There was inclusivity, there was interdisciplinarity. But given the topic, let me focus on the policy relevance side of it, which was one of the three themes. And for us, the critical issue is how IPCC interacts with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there are two kind of timetables within the UNFCCC cycle that we need to think about very carefully. The first one is the second global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, the assessment of progress, which will be completed in 2028 and will probably be a process that starts in 2027. And I know from conversations I had just yesterday with the UNFCCC Secretariat, they are really looking forward with anticipation to what IPCC might produce to help them with that global stocktake. And just to say, I have the privilege of doing a speech at the opening ceremony of COP28, and one of my major missions will be to manage expectations about what actually IPCC can achieve within just a few years. The other timetable is the second round of nationally determined contributions, which are due to be submitted in 2025. And there is some expectation in the UNFCCC Secretariat that IPCC may have something to say about that as well. And given the glacial pace with which we tend to change our procedures and processes, I think this will have to rely on material that IPCC has already produced. So we will have to think of methods and techniques for interpreting the knowledge we have already to help structure the process around these new nationally determined contributions. Now, because I'm one of the people who started a stopwatch, I can see now I have 20 seconds to go here. So I managed to time this quite well. I managed to finish a bureau meeting of IPCC last week 45 minutes early. So I got an excellent record of this, and with 10 seconds to go, I'll stop talking to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Paul and Jim for the invitation to join them today at this panel. It's wonderful to see so many people here interested in this topic. Brief introduction to myself and who I represent. The Aldersgate Group is a coalition of forward-looking businesses who are key, mostly businesses, but also some non-business organisations, NGOs and academic institutions, who are keen to push governments to take more action on climate change and the environment. We're UK-based, and we do also look at international policy to some degree, but for the most part, we're focused in the UK. We have about 70 members, including names you would have heard of: IKEA, John Lewis, Cemex is one of our heavy industry members. So we go right across a range of different sectors, and we bring together our members to discuss some of the really difficult policy problems. They are all really, really keen to help play their part in tackling climate change. And for the most part, quite frustrated about the speed of action and delivery in this country. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the business point of view and how we can help businesses to play their part in tackling climate change. On myself, by the way, I've spent 20-something years working in climate and environment policy, mostly in the government, as Sarah said. And I've been doing this job for about 4 months. So if I'm making mistakes, I apologise to my Aldersgate Group colleagues. But it's absolutely central to delivering change. it's important to remember that we live in a capitalist society, and not only that, we live in one where nearly all our utilities have been privatised. So we depend on the private sector to do nearly everything that's practical in this country in terms of decarbonisation. There are lots of facilitating organisations in the public sector, both at local, regional and central government level, who will set the framework, in some cases offer funding, but they're not so much able to deliver change on their own. And we therefore need to make sure that the framework is set in the right way to enable businesses to deliver the change on the ground. I hark back to COP11, which was in 2005, which I attended. I was in DEFRA at the time, and we ran an event on business engagement with climate change. It was quite a new subject then, and we just started talking about emissions trading, which was a new topic, and businesses were sort of a bit hesitant about how they felt about emissions trading, but wanted to make clear that it could be a useful tool if it was done in the right way. Fast forward quite a lot of years, and emissions trading is really well established now in Europe and also in parts of America, and it kind of works. It's been shown to work if it's tweaked in the right way. Businesses like it because it sets a level playing field as long as it's organised in that way. That was the big conversation then, and it's changed so much the way that business thinks about climate change now. It's really embedded in boardroom conversations. It's considered to be a regulatory issue, a reputational issue, as well as a compliance and really important matter. And I think for Aldersgate Group members and many other businesses in this country, it's a moral issue as well. They have a responsibility, and they see that they have a responsibility to play their part in tackling climate change. So many national governments, of course, have set ambitious emissions reduction targets around the world, and many have also said how this should be met through sectoral action as well. Sectoral meaning in different parts of the economy and by different kinds of organisation. Most large businesses are highly engaged in Europe, but also many other parts of the world. But they also need to make a profit. So the definition of a business, generally speaking, is an organisation that is trying to generate profit in order to then self-sustain itself in future. And with the best will in the world, no business is going to make a choice about an investment which will put themselves out of a job in future. And that means that they're often unwilling to move or to be the first mover in a new technology or in a big change if they don't know that there's going to be a demand for that product in future, or they don't know what price they can get for that product in future. And so they need supporting structures that can help give them certainty. For example, there are some really good examples of where this has worked, where the EU said, you know what, we don't like the old kind of light bulb, they're really inefficient. We're going to mandate that all new light bulbs need to be LEDs, which is what we have now. It worked. Businesses were completely on board with that change. It was fair. Everybody's now selling LEDs, and we've saved a lot of energy around Europe already as a result of that. It's a really simple example, and it's easy to do because it's a manufacturing one. It doesn't get into the fabric of buildings and people's everyday lives in a very material way. But it shows what can be done with regulation, and pretty easily if you do something that's sensible. The same goes for other appliances, fridges, for example, which are all really efficient now, and they didn't used to be. Which comes as a result of regulation. So regulation works and businesses like it. I think that's a message that I have to repeat everywhere I go, because not all governments completely appreciate that. And there's often an assumption that businesses don't want to have regulation applied to them because it might be onerous and burdensome. And yes, that can be true. Red tape is annoying. But if it helps people to move forwards and it helps them to do their bit and do it in a way that's fair with others in the in the economy, they're absolutely up for it. So without that kind of regulation, businesses either need to bet on which technologies and products will be in demand in the future, or they need to be regulated to drive them in particular directions. So regulation does increase the immediate cost of doing business, but if all their competitors are also bearing the same costs, that's okay, and it makes it possible for them to operate in the market. We think, in the Aldersgate Group, we would see much accelerated action on climate change if governments were willing to be bold and commit to sectoral pathways. So a good example of that, and we heard about electric vehicles. What about electrifying home heating? So there's been a bit of conversation in the UK government about whether it's going to be heat pumps or perhaps we're going to have hydrogen supplied into our boilers. I'm sure we can have a whole separate session on whether you think it's a good idea to put hydrogen in boilers. But what the business community needs is for somebody to just say, actually, this is the direction we're going to take. And perhaps this is the way we're going to regulate in order to make that happen. Then the manufacturing will come forward, then the supply chain will happen, and there will be a nation of installers of heat pumps. Let's say that's the direction that's chosen. But at the moment, gas boiler installers are not willing to change and do the training, expensive training, to become heat pump installers because they haven't been told that there will be a market for that new skill. And that goes right through all the different changes that we need to see in society. There needs to be a very clear direction of travel and probably regulatory framework to support those changes. Otherwise, they won't happen, or at least they will happen much, much later than is necessary or could have happened. There may also need to be some kind of financial intervention by governments. So where a technology is very much more expensive, or there's uncertainty about what price can be obtained in the market, governments can intervene to help with that. So contracts for difference for offshore wind is a very much cited example where the government says, we will effectively level the price that you can get for a unit of electricity generated by offshore wind. And where the market price goes above that or below that, we will pay each other the difference. It's worked spectacularly well in the UK offshore wind industry. And that's an example that I think we could see done in other areas, such as hydrogen and carbon capture, which are other very expensive and uncertain areas where the cost could come down in future if the regulation was put in place to support that. It's also worth thinking about the RON regulation in relation to geographies. So it's much harder for large multinational industries with high fixed costs to make changes where, for example, carbon taxes or product standards could just drive those businesses to other countries. Their business to other countries. Steel is one of the examples in this country where if we apply carbon tax to steel production, it's possible that the manufacturers of steel will just go to other countries where carbon taxes aren't applied because they can still access their market, but they can do it at a much lower cost. So there's a long conversation about what we call carbon border adjustment mechanisms that needs to be applied if we want to level the playing field again. It's a phrase we use over and over and over again, but I think it can't be overused, actually. And I think just to come to the end of probably my 10 minutes, all our businesses are right behind, all our member businesses are right behind this change. And they want me to keep saying that. And they want politicians to hear that message. There is no lagging behind. And I think where politicians perceive that people are uncomfortable about moving fast on climate change, and that message begins to waver, it makes it very difficult for businesses to make investment decisions. And so we've had some conversations at government level in the last 6 months where the message has changed. And in a way, it doesn't really matter what the message is. So are we going to phase out electric vehicles in 2030 or 2035? Everyone has a different view on that. Doesn't really matter what the answer is. Let's choose one and carry on doing it and not change the plan. And that's what everybody would like the government to be doing in order that investment decisions can be made. So in order to drive the change that Jim has described as necessary, really, really urgently, we think that let's see that framework happening, let's see government direction coming forwards, and the money will flow to support it. And over to Carl now.
So academic that I am, I'm going to use a few slides. And first thing I need to do is get out of this one. Here we go. And there's only one graph I'm going to show you after this. This is what the book looks like in terms of the topics that it covers, and that's why I show it to you, because I've got 10 minutes, and Sarah would definitely not allow me to go through all the policies in all those areas, all of which are complex and difficult. So that's it. I'm just going to do what I always tell my PhD students to do, is tell us the narrative. What's the story behind this book? And we start with the challenge. This is why it's worth writing the book. So you see the column 2020 budget. That was the amount of carbon dioxide that could be emitted to stay within the 1.5 degree global warming target as of 2020, and that was in the AR7 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. By 2023, that had shrunk to 380 gigatons. And on the basis of new methods, it's now 260 gigatons. So you can see that we're chewing up that carbon budget extremely quickly. If carbon dioxide emissions are roughly 40 gigatons a year, you can see that that budget will be exhausted by the time we get to 2030. So just when Jim and the IPCC is publishing its new 7th assessment, well, we will have blown the 1.5 degree target on current emission levels. And that's the reference there. So that's the challenge. The top level message from the book is that we've got to stop emitting this stuff. We've got to stop cutting down trees. And we've got to, because we've left this so long, we've got to start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as fast as ever we can. And obviously the book goes into some detail as to how we do those things. When I started the book, I was kind of agnostic as to what I would find. And to my pleasure, I found, when I looked at all the policies across these areas that have been introduced over the last 20 to 30 years, we know what policies to use, and we know that they work. And Rachel gave a number of examples of that. I would add, from the economics point of view, we know that they are affordable. So we know what to do, we know that it works, and we know that we can afford it. So you may well then ask, well, why don't we do it? And the first reason is the fossil fuel industry. One of those things I should have remembered to tell you about on the graph was the one on the far right, which showed that the oil wells, coal mines, and all associated infrastructure the fossil fuel industry has already invested in will, if used, produce 780 gigatons of carbon dioxide, whereas we've only got 280 before 1.5. Why did they invest in this stuff? Because they don't believe governments will keep the 1.5 degree target. And they're doing everything they can to stop governments keeping that target, and they're continuing to put the vast majority of their investment into new coal mines, new oil and gas wells, because they want to make money. So that is easily the biggest problem that we have, and it's encapsulated by the fact that the next COP in Abu Dhabi is chaired by the CEO of the national oil company, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and that is a company that has enormous plans for global fossil fuel expansion around the world. Problem number two is this thing called the voluntary carbon market. And this is a system whereby companies that feel reducing emissions is a bit too difficult go off and pay someone else to reduce emissions. And the big problem with that is that most of the schemes that have come to attention recently have shown that these other guys are not reducing emissions. So they're paying the money, but the emissions aren't going down. But the other guys aren't reducing their emissions either. The other guys' emissions are still going up. We've got to start taking emissions out of the atmosphere, but let's not think that we're offsetting them, and therefore we don't have to reduce emissions that we're actually producing at the moment. Then, from an economics point of view, and this is something that causes me to weep often, that the governments who say that they're concerned about climate change actually subsidize the use of fossil fuels to the tune of about $500 billion per year. And that's straight cash pay. Governments, taxpayers, you and me, paying oil companies to produce fossil fuel. Well, under those circumstances, I know we're not serious about climate change. And then there are politicians who believe, wrongly, that the transition to low-carbon energy will make the cost of living crisis worse for their citizens. We've heard quite a bit of that from the UK government over the last few months. The whole thrust towards a just transition suggests that that need to be the case, and all the economics that I trust in this field suggests that actually the low-carbon transition is going to be very good for the economies that undertake it in a sensible fashion. So Lord Stern, back in 2007, said it was the growth opportunity of the 21st century. That was echoed by the Conservative politician Chris Skidmore in his net zero review earlier this year. And yet, we have this blah blah going on in the political space saying this is going to be terribly expensive. And of course, publics get very confused by that. They're not economists, they don't understand what's going on. Many of them are unaware of the seriousness of the problem and how it's going to affect them and their children in the future. And some of them still deny it. But above all, they don't want to change their behavior. You would have seen in the papers recently the issues to do with the fact that it is middle class and richer people who produce the vast majority of carbon emissions because we're living lifestyles that we enjoy. What do we need to do in order to address this? Above all, we need investment. Above all, we need to create the buildings, the industry, the transport that is much more energy efficient, that is powered by zero carbon energy carriers, so electricity, hydrogen, biomass, biofuels. We need a grid that can distribute that electricity when and where it's needed. And we need the transport, infrastructure, and vehicles that use electricity instead of fossil fuels, and the heating and cooling systems in our buildings that use electricity instead of gas in the UK. All of that is using technologies that we know work, but do work on a large scale in different parts of the world, and the task is simply to implement that investment and do it. I say simply, it's obviously not simple, but it's not rocket science either, because we've done it, as Rachel said, we've done it with offshore wind, which 15 years ago, everyone was predicting was going to be far too expensive for anyone except nutters to implement. We also need to transform the food system, and I'm very pleased I've managed to put in a large chapter on agriculture, which isn't my academic specialism at all, because it's absolutely critical. It produces a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's got to change. Behaviors will also have to change, and the early decision in the book was to say, well, how much do I think people will change their behavior voluntarily? And I think the evidence suggests not much. So most of it is done and will be done by technology, but you can see the kind of changes. And this will involve lots of different policies all together. So while I think carbon pricing is really important, carbon pricing by itself will not be enough. And we need government to get serious and actually work out how it's going to do it. Finally, there are these two absolutely critical overarching issues, which is that Europe can go to zero emissions and it won't make a blind bit of difference to the climate. The people who really got to start developing in a low-carbon way are the emerging and developing countries. They can't do that by themselves, and if the rich countries don't step up to the plate and help them to develop in a low-carbon way, they will develop in a high-carbon because they want development above. And then we come to the just transition, the climate justice issues. The poorest people in the world, as Jim said, have done practically nothing to cause this problem. And yet they're paying the highest price. Awful picture. A third of Pakistan. Just imagine the unbelievable suffering for those poor farmers who just had very little and saw what they had completely swept away. And the rich countries are going to have to help that, and that's part of the just transition. But the just transition is also about relatively low-income countries in this country, protecting them from carbon taxes or price of energy or whatever, and about shifting the people who are currently working in the high-carbon part of the economy over into the low part of the economy. There's lots to do. We know how to do it. We just got to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, Rachel and Jim, for those really interesting initial remarks and provocations. Lots to get our teeth stuck into. I'm just going to abuse my privilege and start us off, if I may, with a question around COP. It starts in 10 days from now. You have all set out, I think very eloquently, some of the major challenges that we still face as a country and as a planet. What are the outcomes we should be looking for? How will we know if COP28 is being successful? Can we start with you, Jim?
Yeah, sure. And just one thing to say, there are three goals in the Paris Agreement. One is on reducing emissions, one is on adaptation, and the other one is on finance. And this has been largely a mitigation, reducing emissions conversation so far. And the success of any COP is really dependent on taking these three interlocking pieces and make them work together, because we will not get success on any one unless we get success on all of them. So this, I think, is the situation that we are in, is going to be heavy on impacts and adaptation from this COP. We're going to see work on a global goal for adaptation. We're going to see work on loss and damage for these people for damages that we cannot avoid in the future. And we are already not well adapted to the climate we live in at the moment. And there will be a lot of pressure on developed countries to step up their financing as well. So that will be part of it. But of course, reducing emissions is obviously a critical part of it. And what I think we expect to see, given where we are at in the current stage of the cycle, the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement will end with this COP28, and would be an interesting process to try to get to governments to agree on what stock should be taken, if I can put it that way. But I think in mitigation, what we're probably more likely to see is a set of more side agreements on specific things like renewable energy. I'm not waiting with bated breath for any significant move forward in the ambition of nationally determined contributions, for example, in terms of emissions. But there will be a confirmation of more specific progress. And just to say, given its nature, it will be a very technology-flavoured COP as well. There will be a big innovation zone with a lot of companies there. Just to say, it'll be the biggest COP ever. There are going to be 70,000 people, which is truly extraordinary. Yeah.
Thank you. Rachel, what should businesses be asking for? The first thing to say is 70,000 people at COP are not doing the negotiating. Nearly all of them are in the surrounding area, and it's a slightly strange thing because we talk about COP as though it's this enormous climate event, which it is, but actually the kind of the detail end of it is the most important bit. However, that surrounding 69,000 people, however many are not involved in the negotiations, are raising the profile. They are making clear how different sectors are committed to action, and they are lobbying governments to go faster and further, and that is incredibly important. There are a number of different initiatives that businesses sign up to say that they are going to be accelerating, and they're champions and all sorts of different things, which obviously we encourage everyone to do. I think there are some high-level things that we would be keen to see from the negotiations, particularly in terms of sectoral progress, so renewable energy targets, the much contested wording about phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels, which was discussed 2 years ago, and not much progress happened last year in terms of how that wording evolved. But there will be all eyes will be on, for example, what will be the UK's position around that wording, and is it possible to get any change around that? So, combination of as much noise as possible to get governments to take action, along with just seeing a bit of progress in the technical wording, I think is what we would be keen to see. Paul, other than reading Paul's book, which is obviously the first.
Well, no, not at all. I mean, the people at COP aren't going to read my book, unfortunately. But the first thing to say, not all businesses at COP are going to be asking governments to go faster. The single biggest business lobby will be the fossil fuel industry. They live in the Middle East, so there are lots of them from the Middle East will come, and they will be doing everything they can to stop governments going faster and faster. And we know that because we've seen them do it. So those arguments about phasing out fossil fuels, they will be absolutely saying this is totally unrealistic, you can't do that, we're going to be producing fossil fuels well into the next millennium, and that's something that the others there were going to have to counter. The goal that is already being discussed, which in my view is most likely, is the tripling of renewables by 2030. Because everyone loves renewables, they're getting cheaper and cheaper, although they were until quite recently. Offshore wind, but photovoltaics still getting cheaper and cheaper. They're being installed enormously fast, and people are making money out of it. Businesses are making money out of them. So that's likely to come. I hope we will get serious about methane reduction. Methane, for those that don't know, is the second most important greenhouse gas, and it's far more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. And at the Glasgow COP 2 years ago, countries said they were going to get serious about methane reduction. 2 years later, they have not got serious about methane reduction. It's quite easy to get serious about it. We could, for example, ban the oil rigs in the North Sea from flaring gas when they produce oil and gas. We don't do that. That would be a very good thing to do, and it would be a relatively easy thing to do, not cheap for the fossil fuel industry, but I've not noticed that they're short of money just now. The one I've got my eye on, because it's been so conspicuous by its absence in previous years, is that France and I think Mexico have brought 80 countries asking for global taxation. Global taxation on fossil fuels, global taxation perhaps on flights, global taxation perhaps on global shipping, global taxation on financial transactions. And that to me is the most hopeful way forward, because there is no way individual countries are going to find the sums of money that are needed for this transformation, especially in emerging and developing economies, without some form of global taxation. And any of those would be very good candidates. Then there's the loss and damage agenda, which is very controversial. It only appeared at all at the last COP in Egypt. At the moment, there's no detail about who pays into the fund, who gets money from the fund, and on what kind of basis, and how's it going to be managed and administered. And obviously, until those things are sorted out, there won't be a functioning loss and damage framework. And then finally, there are these things called joint energy transition plans, which, again, are enormously hopeful because they're ways in which rich countries came together with countries that are currently very carbon intensive in order to try to get them on a different development path. There's one for South Africa, there's one for Indonesia, there are two in preparation for India and Vietnam, and these are really getting real. They're not making the progress that I would like them to make, but they're there, they're institutional, there is supposedly money behind them, and they will cost money, and that's something that needs to be replicated more widely in other countries.
Thank you. Over to you all very shortly, so please have a think about your questions. I am just going to trespass on your patience for 2 more minutes, so in a minute each, I think. You've all talked very powerfully about climate justice, about fairness, about equity. And actually, I think what came across very strongly from all of you was that is perhaps the unlocker to some of what we're talking about. Your book, Paul, says that the problem is easy to state, harder to solve. Actually, I think you have all set out that the solutions are also relatively easy to say. It is the question is how we galvanise action. So is that question of equity and justice the unlocker? And if so, what do we do about it? But about a minute each, and then we will go to you.
Well, I go for first. I'd actually look at it a different way, and just to say, in many ways, we've done the easy bit of emissions reduction because it's been a lot of it has come from renewable energy, for example, in changing electricity systems. And that doesn't touch people's lives. It doesn't, when you turn on the switch, it doesn't matter whether it came from a nuke, a wind turbine, or a gas-fired power station. But the next stage of emissions reduction is going to touch people's lives much more directly. And that is actually where the fairness and the equity issues are going to come in more strongly. So although we do have the tools, I think we're going to need to apply tools in a different way, with some interesting side effects from applying the tools that we need to be very careful about.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me talk about two UK-specific equity issues. One is energy efficiency in our homes. If we had a really good energy efficiency strategy, we could bring down nearly everybody's utility bills in their house. It costs a varying amount per household to do that. Somehow the government finds it incredibly hard to get its act together and make that happen. But it's a relatively low cost and doable intervention which would have direct equity benefits. The second one is industrial strategy. We've got a number of industries that will be obsolete at some point. And what we need to do is make sure that we don't pull the same trick as we pulled with closing coal mines and just leave a load of communities stranded without that industry anymore. We need a really clear strategy from the government working with business that says, this is what our future industry looks like. This is how we're going to grow it and bring interesting, well-paid jobs into those communities which are losing previous industries. I would just give an example of oil refineries around the country. We've got 6 or 7 oil refineries around the coast which are currently doing fine. They won't be necessary at some point when Paul's been successful. And we need to make sure that the people who work there are doing good work in hydrogen production, CCS, new kinds of technology. And there is an opportunity there to reduce emissions and provide for equity if it's done in the right way.
Thank you, Paul. Briefly. Yeah, just very briefly, I'm going to concentrate on the international stuff because I think that's where, at the COP meeting, that's where it's going to be make or break. The developing countries are not going to have the patience to go on in this process unless they get help for adaptation, which Jim said, and unless they get loss and damage and they get help in order to develop in a low-carbon way. We're beginning to see the institutions that might do that, but they're coming into place much too slowly, and the sources of finance are yet really to be determined, which is why I think that global taxation idea is so important and needs to get some traction.
Thank you all. Okay, over to you. The roving mics. I'm going to start where James is nearest, and we're going to work our way this way, if that's all right. If you could briefly say who you are, where you're from, and keep your your questions short.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Simran, and I'm studying Masters in Public Policy here. So my question is that, do you think that COPs are adequately focusing on agriculture, considering that our food waste are increasing, yields are getting lower, and soil degradation is at the highest? So are we adequately focusing on that? That's
Thank you. We'll take a couple. So it's gentleman just in front, and then we'll move with some.
Thank you. Patrick Newman. I'm concerned about tipping points. I mean, could tipping points be such that we might be seeing 1.5 in 25?
Was there a lady just in front of you?
Hi, I'm Lynette Chapman. Is there a place for AI in this? In which case, we're talking about a different kind of jobs and things. As a grandmother, I've learned from my grandchildren that I won't even understand what kind of jobs they'll be doing. And surely AI must be coming into this factor as well.
Thank you. Okay, so agriculture, tipping point, AI. You can answer them all. You can pick and choose a little bit. Let's just shake the order up and start with Paul this time.
Yeah, really good point about agriculture, because one of climate change's impacts, which we haven't begun to see yet, is its impacts on food production and food security, especially in those most impacted parts of the world, as in Pakistan, that example that I gave earlier. And no, we haven't taken that adequately into account. When you think that we are still growing populations and that food production will be impacted in many parts of the world, and agriculture, as we currently practice, produces 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. and expands into forests, which means that the forests also produce greenhouse gas emissions when they're cut down, you can see that that entire nature part of climate change is one that hasn't had enough attention. It's starting to get it, and there will be a food day at this COP, I think, for the first time.
Rachel, Jane. Okay, I'll try the AI question. I've got an 8-year-old daughter, and she's already better at her computer than I am, and wants to work in that area. Well, she wants to be a Minecraft YouTuber, but anyway. Yes, though. So all our business members at the Aldersgate Group are thinking about the role of AI in delivering their businesses, which takes such a wide range of kinds of things. So the information-led businesses are the obvious ones. Probably I'll be out of a job at some point in the next 5 years because computers will be able to synthesize policy recommendations, for example. But what that ought to do is release humans to do the jobs that can't be done by AI. You can't install a boiler or a heat pump using just a computer. As far as I know, I'm not sure that will ever be possible. And there are a number of manufacturing type jobs and construction, that kind of thing. And so those should be the jobs that are esteemed and wanted by our next generation. I think a lot of that goes to, just to take the question on the sideways angle, skills and training and our assumptions about careers in the future. And what is it that my daughter is going to hear when she's 15 and talking to a careers advisor? I hope they just don't go down the list and say, lawyer, actuary, architect, whatever. They're actually describing what the future looks like and possible paths that she could take, taking into account the fact that there will be a kind of IT-led approach to the society in the future.
Yeah, and maybe say something about each of them. Just to say, agriculture and land use gets a lot of attention at all COPs. I mean, obviously, with 70,000 people, some of them are looking at land use and agriculture. In fact, in the last cycle, IPCC produced a special report on land where we, for the first time, conceptualised this as a food system which covered the whole system, rather than just agriculture and the supply side, recalling that about 25% of food is wasted, mainly in the distribution system in developing countries, or left on the side of a plate or in the fridge in developed countries. So, I mean, this wider perspective matters. On tipping points, 1.5 is not a tipping point in any scientific sense. I mean, we constantly try to get the message that every fraction of a degree matters. But there are tipping points in specific places and in specific regions and specific kinds of systems where you can reach tipping points where systems change irrevocably. And in fact, one of the most popular topics that has come up by governments for another special report from IPCC would be on tipping points specifically. So I think that is registered. I can't promise we'll do it, but it's certainly been called for. And just finally on AI, that's something that just permeates society completely, and it'll touch on our activities as well as everything else. In a very parochial way, we're worrying about it in IPCC to think about whether it could help you work through the 40 to 50,000 new climate change articles that are published every year, and also thinking about, can we detect when authors have submitted AI-generated text instead of writing it themselves? So we are thinking about all these issues.
Brilliant, thank you. We've been somebody very patient. Just stand here, Nina. Gentleman with his hand up, and then next to him.
Hello, Peter Golden from London. Carbon capture is doing a lot. How much heavy lifting is carbon capture doing in the IPCC middle scenarios? And what temperature are we heading for in 2100 if you take carbon capture out of those equations and we're carry on with our present rate of nationally determined contributions realization?
That's that. I think just next to you.
Hi there. My name is Daniel. I am currently a student at UCL, but also work in climate strategy in a UK financial institution. And my question is around, I sort of completely agree with what's been said, there does need to be more regulation. Are there limits to how far and fast business should push government, given they are not elected? what are those limits in terms of both the style of activism that they perform with the government in their interactions with them? Thank you.
A little bit, orange to throw it.
Hi there, this is Jay, and I come from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. But also I was a student at UCL, sitting in the exactly same lecture, listening to Paul's lecture nearly a decade ago. I've got probably a slightly controversial question. So there's a recent report, just come out from Oxfam and Stockholm Resilience Institute. The key message from the report is about climate, inequity, talking about 1% of the richest people in the world, produce more than 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And one of their recommendations is to tax global taxation of the super rich. I know there are lots of pros and cons of that, so I'd love to hear from the panelists what would be the pros and the cons of adopting a policy like that.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll take this, and then I can see your hand at the back. We'll come to the back row in the next round. Okay, so the role of carbon capture, how essential is it? The limits to business demands of an elected government, and equity, and is global taxation policy the answer? We're going to start with Drake.
Taxing the super rich. I think the main thing is the more that could be done at a global level, the more possible it will be. Because obviously, if we hike up tax on the super rich in the UK, they'll just go somewhere else. In fact, they already do for that reason. Because our taxes are much lower than in some parts of the world. So it doesn't really solve the problem. It just means that they go and emit somewhere else. Doing a completely international agreement on taxation has never been done. I'm not sure it ever will be done, but we're trying with climate policy, so you never know. But I can't see another way of forcing people with a lot of money to change their behaviour other than every single country in the world making that possible, which is a bit depressing. But anyway, on appropriate business engagement, businesses are not in the end legislators, so they don't make law and they don't have the power to set frameworks and that kind of thing that government does, which means that in a way it's kind of up to them how much they choose to lobby, because it doesn't create the change in itself. It's up to the legislature what they actually do with that. Now, there is a question about appropriate ways of engaging, and I would hope that all Scape members would engage in inappropriate ways involving bribery and all sorts of other things that have been described in the press and that kind of thing. So that's where it becomes inappropriate, is where you are effectively getting access or paying for a change. I think in the UK we have a very low level of that kind of activity. I'm happy to say this is probably on the record, isn't it? In other parts of the world, not so much, and there's quite a significant problem, I think, in some countries in terms of businesses, and I mean countries where business and government are almost the same thing as well. Is interesting. In this country, I think we have one of the most progressive business communities in the world. We have, I heard somebody say yesterday, more businesses as a percent of total activity that have set net zero targets, that have put in place transition plans, that are engaging with the different, if you work for a financial institution, you will know this, but the various different kinds of financial disclosures and that kind of thing that have been put in place here. There is a great deal of interest in that, and it is more so than in the United States, I think, for example, where even though the United States financial framework supports change through the Inflation Reduction Act and incentivises the investment in the right sorts of thing, actually there's a lot more laggard behaviour in the business community, I think we'd probably find. So in this country, we're very lucky with that kind of progressive nature of engagement. Obviously, there are always different approaches, but I don't think one should apply limits beyond the kind of moral ones.
Yeah, just quickly on the super rich. Quite apart from the difficulties of getting a global taxation of that kind, in a sense, it's missing the right target. We may or may not like the fact that we have great income inequality. That's a kind of political distribution question about income. For this conversation, we're talking about carbon emissions. So what we want to do is tax the activities that are mainly engaged in by the super rich. that produce carbon emissions, which is why I had that list of carbon taxation. That would hit the super rich far, far harder than it hits the people who don't produce any carbon emissions. That's why I mentioned aircraft flights, because it's the super rich above all who fly very, very often. Not just the super rich, obviously, but 50% of people in this country fly once a year or less. So that all the rest of the flights are taken by probably people like us who have, we're not in that lower part of the income. So concentrate on the carbon, concentrate on the activities that produce carbon emissions, and then by all means tax them. And you will find that it is the super rich that are paying the taxes. On the other side, that of course is why it's so difficult, because the super rich don't want to pay those taxes. And the super rich have political power, and they're able to lobby politicians to stop those taxes getting into place. But that's the nature of the issue. And on business, the only thing I'm going to say about that is limits to lobbying. Government's task is to make low-carbon activities profitable. That's the one thing government has to do. Business will do the rest. If business can make money from it, they will make money from it. And it's government's job to make sure that the way businesses make money are low carbon. And that's why they're going to have to focus very hard on low carbon technologies and all the mechanisms such as the contracts for difference that Rachel talked about, and how they're going to have to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and make the fossil fuel industry unprofitable. Because for as long as it is profitable, those companies are going to produce oil and gas.
And Jim, nobody's addressed the carbon capture.
I'll keep my remarks to carbon capture then. And just to say, this was the very question I was poking the 6th assessment cycle scenario database for this afternoon before I came out, because the answer is not very easy to pick out of the IPCC reports. But I think the answer is it appears in almost all of the scenarios, which are at 1.5 or 2 degree levels of ambition, and it appears to be that carbon capture is most used in the mid-decades of this century until the point at which fossil fuels are actually phased out. So there's a bit of a bulge in CCS mid-century. Now, your other question was what happens if you take carbon capture and storage out of the equation. Now, the way that the people run these models, they put an environmental constraint on them, press the enter key and see what comes out of it. And basically what the models have a kind of airbed effect in them. So if you take carbon capture and storage out, the mitigation gap is then filled by other things like renewables, efficiency, carbon dioxide removal, etc. And it costs slightly more because might have taken a cheaper option out of the picture, but you still can reach the targets. So the message that I would give there is the answer does not lie in the models and the scenarios, it lies in real life. And I think we ought to remember that as well. We can make choices about these different approaches.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, moving to the back now, and then we will come forward. I can see 2 hands there, but the very back row, if we could start with.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Corrales. I am from Colombia, to the Caribbean part. My question is about what is the impact of the neocolonialism in the climate crisis. And I want to talk about it because I am from a little city in one of the poorest places in Colombia. And we have many problems with water supply. Every day die a lot of kids, a lot of people because we don't have water. But it's very crazy because we have a lot of resources and big companies take that resources, and now we have many problems with that. So I think talk about neocolonialism and the impact that have in all communities is very important. Right now I am leader, but in the same way I work with indigenous and ethnic communities, Afro communities, and they have a lot of problem for that. So for me, it's important to talk about neocolonialism and the importance to have security policies, because we have a lot of conflicts and nobody cared about it.
Thank you. And then if we can come forward, I can see two hands there.
Hi, James Moyer here, and I just kind of wanted to get your view on so-called emergency brake climate solutions, or solar geoengineering, which has a controversial history and limited testing, but within the context of some projections suggesting Earth will breach certain targets. Some believe this emergency solution will be necessary.
Thank you. Anthony, just open to you.
Hi, I'm Alex Wheeler. I'm a regenerative coach, and I think what I'm observing and what I really wanted to get your point of view on is how much do you see we are looking at the root cause of addressing the root cause of why we are where we are now, and why we're actually not taking actions, which from a coaching standpoint and the understanding of how human works and how human actually take actions, our actions are the reflections of our mindset and our skill set. And therefore, what is kind of worrying me in a lot of the discussions I see or books that I read is that everything is very much directed at what are the tools, what are the technologies, what are the innovations we're going to drive. But at the end is the people who are going to do them, who are going to take the change on board. And I was curious to see as well among the COP28, what are the discussions around how do we actually equip people to come out of that survival mode that we are in right now, which is freeze, flight, fight or fawn, which is exactly what we see when we don't take action or deny climate, and actually equipping them with a way to deal with their fears, their emotion, and changing the underlying extractive mindset that we live in.
Thank you. We're going to try and squeeze in one more, James, just to your left of the stairs. Let's go.
Hello, I'm Gabby Barker, currently working as a climate change consultant. Regulation is a really important driver of change, and I'm aware that climate regulation is adding quite significantly to the regulatory burden that a lot of companies are experiencing. This is less impactful for larger organizations, but I was just wondering, is there a way that we can help support SMEs that are currently struggling with the regulation burden and helping incentivize them to meet these requirements, as well as not adding to their already kind of stretched resources?
Thank you very much. So that's impact of neocolonialism and how to support vulnerable communities. What about emergency brakes and geoengineering solutions? Are we really addressing the root cause of awareness and support for SMEs? Let's start again.
Right. Okay. I'll have a go at the first two. And just to say, I mean, the word neocolonialism has never appeared in an IPCC report, and I don't expect to ever see it being approved. But let me flag this and first say thank you, Columbia, for a very nice lead authors meeting at the Tropical Agriculture Centre in Cali, where we had a great time. But I think the question, one of the things we're addressing is the greater use of Indigenous knowledge in IPCC assessments. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services actually does it far better than we do. And I would certainly intend to learn lessons from them about how we get these perspectives into IPCC reports. And we're also working, while we're at COP28, there is a set of external constituencies in the convention. One of them is the Indigenous Peoples Organisation, and we're working up our relationships with that at the moment. So without using the word, I hope we are starting to approach some of the issues that you've raised. On emergency solutions, this is a solar radiation. Geoengineering covers two kinds of things. It can be used to cover carbon dioxide removal, and it can be used to cover solar radiation modification. which are entirely different approaches, which is why IPCC never uses the word geoengineering, which try to keep them separate. Solar radiation modification is a very difficult one because it's an action, but it's not mitigation, and it doesn't fall neatly anywhere. There are elements in Working Group 1 on the physical science, Working Group 2 because of the side effects of the potential interventions, on Working Group 3 because it's seen as that kind of action that might be related to CDR. I think there's a lot of interest in perhaps IPCC doing more on it. But just to say, this is no simple solution. There are all sorts of issues. We actually, in Working Group 3, covered the legal and ethical aspects of solar radiation modification in the last cycle. And there are very clear issues around the fact that it doesn't solve all of the problems associated with climate change. It doesn't fix ocean acidification, for example. There are many regional potential side effects depending where the experiments would be applied. And there's a kind of a moral hazard issue that once you've started doing it, you can't stop. Otherwise, you get a sudden reversal. So there's all sorts of issues. I mean, it can be considered, but there is not a lot of enthusiasm among many scientific communities for actually doing physical kind of SRM research, much more paper studies, modelling, etc., to try to understand the implications without actually making any interventions.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll take the other two questions. SMEs. I think the first thing to say is a lot of climate regulations don't apply to SMEs because those who have made the regulations understand that applying additional burdens is unfair and disproportionate. What that means, though, is it's very hard for those small businesses to actually do anything because they're very busy trying to stay afloat in most cases, and particularly at the moment in this economic cycle. And so what they need is support and motivation, guidance and incentivization. Really good example, installation of solar panels a couple of years ago was zero rated for VAT. And that helps small solar installers to get additional business and start installing panels on houses where it's just now a little bit cheaper for that work to be done as a result of that tax incentive. And I think I would take the whole question the other way around, which is we're just not providing that support and incentivization at the moment. And we will massively depend on our SME community to deliver a lot of the changes that we need to see now. We've done a lot of the big technology, which tends to be driven by large organizations, large companies. But even with large companies, a lot of their supply chains are SMEs. If you think about companies that do a lot of haulage, they often employ kind of small companies, single person drivers with a truck, who have no way of complying with very significant new legislation, and they can't afford to buy an electric truck, even if it was possible to recharge it. And so, yeah, I don't know that there is an enormous burden of climate regulation on small companies, but I know that they can't get out of the starting blocks at the moment in many cases. Are we getting to the root cause of it? No, we're not. This drives me crackers, and I think I don't know how you ever get to the bottom of that because there is, generally speaking, no incentive for government, business or anybody else to get to what drives people's choices and what makes people feel something. There's no economic output to that. There's no measurable change, and governments and businesses both kind of thrive on stuff that they can measure and make money out of. And it's a really, really hard one. There are people, organisations thinking about it for sure. So there are academics who do lots of work, I think, on motivations and drivers. There are consultants who think about behaviour change, which isn't quite what you were saying, but that area of work. But it's very hard to build that into policy development in a way that you can then kind of write a paper that says, when I have done this intervention with the public, therefore this thing will happen. So it just doesn't happen. I would also say, and this is probably really controversial, but a lot of policy and industry was done 50 years ago by men. And I know that men are not all the same and women are not all the same, but there is an archetype of female ways of thinking about the world, which I would say is helpful. And thank you for having me on the panel. And we are seeing more and more women in our internet. So there is steadiness hope because there are, we've had Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. We saw her thinking about policy in a different way. And I hope that this kind of integration of society will drive towards a different way of thinking in the future. fun to follow, though. Channel, you're in a woman, I think.
Yes, I've been looking very hard for it for some time. I mean, the one thing I would add to what Rachel said on the culture side, and, this is way outside my comfort zone, is that the civil society and NGO movement has been working on these issues for years, trying to break what we might call the culture of consumption. And the ESRC had a great program of work on the culture of consumption. I was actually the director of the ESRC's program on human behavior, really trying to understand why do we behave the way we do, and why do we have these kind of denialist type responses to the sorts of challenges which we've been talking about this evening. All I can say is that so far we don't have any answers as to how you break it, precisely because, as Rachel said, business and government is operating in a completely different kind of space. I got quite enthusiastic when it first came up about the Transition Towns movement, which some of you will be aware of, which was very much a locally kind of based, local development model around community, around people doing things for themselves, around people supporting each other, and directly turning away from the culture of consumption. But like so many of these other movements that I've seen in the course of my life and been part of to some extent, they haven't amounted to a row of beads. And they've not really affected the way in which most people think, the way most people go about their lives, and the way most people generate, to use the economist's word, generate their utility or pleasure or happiness or whatever that is. So,
very bad, Chair. And because we're now at time.
Right.
So what I am going to
stop me there
is stop roll there. I know you noticed how gracefully I did that. I am thinking to ask you all to give us 3 more minutes, because I would really like to allow the panel a final word, ideally a final sentence. When I was little, my mum used to say to me quite a lot, where there's a will, there's a way. And I think what I've heard tonight is that the way is there. I am less convinced the will is there. Please feel free to disagree. But knowing everything you know after the discussion tonight, are we better to feel optimistic or pessimistic about our future prospects? And we will start with Jim if we can.
Well, okay, I'm actually going to start with a little anecdote on gender, because when I was campaigning to be chair, I was in a country in Southeast Asia and being introduced to a panel by a supportive woman, and she introduced me by saying, there's far much testosterone at the top of IPCC, but Jim is different. That worried me a lot. Okay, so I'll lead into my point. I've said in places that I'm genetically optimistic, though you sometimes have to struggle a lot. It is important when we deal with climate change that we get a diversity of views and try to build consensus. And that diversity covers gender, but it also covers different perspectives in different parts of the world. So that process of consensus building, I think, is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Jim. Rachel? I've been doing this job for 4 months, and I have been to so many conferences, I can't even count them anymore. And what gives me hope is how many people have been at those conferences. We have talked about climate change and the environment from every single different point of view, and packed rooms. I don't think it would have been like this 15 years ago. There is much, much more awareness of the problem. There is much, much more awareness of the solutions. There is a really large part of society that wants to do something if only they could sort of work out how. And with this level, and at all ages and kind of across different parts of society. So if we all leave this room now and go and talk to our friends, that's another 5 people who've talked about it today. And I do think that that's spreading, and there is reason to hope, given the amount of attention that's being paid.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I don't do optimism and pessimism. I think they're self-indulgent. Pessimism gives one an excuse not to get out of bed on Monday morning, because the one thing we know about pessimism is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't do stuff when we're pessimistic. And optimism is, in a way, just as bad, because it stops you looking at the facts. It turns you into Pollyanna. And the facts are pretty scary, as I showed right in that initial slide. there, and we need to understand that. But the facts are also that lots of people want to do stuff and find that they are inhibited from doing that. And it has to be the job of anyone who thinks about these tasks, both to internalize the things they need to do for themselves, and we're all part of the problem, but then to actually identify what the barriers are to actually doing things on a larger scale, and wherever they find themselves in society, in their lives, in their jobs, in their institutions, actually to try to remove those barriers. So neither optimistic nor pessimistic, just get on with it.
I think Paul there is channeling his inner JFDI, as somebody once referred it to me. Just do it and I won't fill in the S. Thank you all very much indeed for coming along tonight, for your participation. For those of you whose questions we didn't get to, I'm very sorry, but we would love it if you could join us for a drink downstairs in the South Cloisters, and you can ask your questions there and continue the conversations. So please join me in thanking Paul Ekins.